Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Gretchen Crosby Sims, the Executive Director here at the Institute of Politics. We are excited to welcome back to campus two of the most outspoken critics of Russia, well, I should say of perhaps the current leader of Russia, UChicago alumnus Bill Browder and former IOP Pritzker Fellow Vladimir Kara-Murza. Congratulations to Mr. Browder, who tonight is receiving a 2019 Alumni Professional Achievement Award from the UChicago Alumni Association. I do want to mention a couple of events before we get started. Next Monday, we will have Brian Hook, the State Department's Special Representative to Iran, who will be in conversation with the New York Times National Security Correspondent David Sanger. And on Wednesday, we're convening a panel of community organizers from around the city to discuss the art of grassroots activism and what young advocates can learn from Chicago organizers. And on Friday, Michelle Norris, former host of NPR's All Things Considered, will be discussing her ongoing race card project, its legacy, and how it can help us understand today's American politics. For more information about our events, please visit our website at politics.uchicago.edu. Audience questions. We will, as always, have questions after our conversation from the audience. You can line up behind the microphone that's going to be in the center aisle. And remember that everybody's welcome at the mic. So if you're a first year, please don't be shy. We do give priority for the first 3 questions to students. I'd like to ask you now to please make sure that your phones are on silent. And now, to formally introduce our speakers is Ellie Citron. Ellie is a second year from Boston. Last summer, she received an IOP grant to intern at the Anti-Defamation League's Civil Rights Division. And this year, she is an intern for the Posen Center for Human Rights. Please join me in welcoming Ellie to the podium.
I am honored to welcome back Bill Browder, class of 1985, to the University of Chicago campus today on behalf of the Institute of Politics to discuss his deep human rights involvements in America, globally, and most crucially in Russia. After graduating from the college and then Stanford Business School, Mr. Browder served as the CEO of Hermitage Capital Management. When Mr. Browder uncovered a corruption scheme involving many high-ranking Russian officials, he was refused entry back into Russia in 2005 and was deemed a national security threat by the Kremlin. The Russian government, too, aimed to subdue Browder by taking down those within his inner circle. In 2009, they captured, tortured, and killed Sergei Magnitsky, Mr. Browder's lawyer. This event, something deeply felt, spurred on the next phase of Mr. Browder's life as an intense human rights activist. Mr. Browder's deep human rights work led to the passing of the Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act in 2012 by Congress, a law which gives the U.S. government the freedom to sanction and punish human rights offenders. Mr. Browder's current work involves expanding the reach of the Magnitsky Act, bringing it to numerous countries around the globe. It was through the reading of his book, Red Notice, that my initial interest in human rights was piqued. I owe it to Mr. Browder and his moving story for much of what I am passionate about in this world today. In conversation with Mr. Browder is Vladimir Kara-Murza, the chairman of the Boris Nemtsov Foundation for Freedom and the vice president of the Free Russia Foundation. He was the former deputy leader of the People's Freedom Party and was a candidate for the Russian State Duma. He too played an instrumental role in the passage of the Magnitsky Act, and in 2015 and 2017 was poisoned and left in a coma, all purportedly for politically motivated reasons. Mr. Kara-Murza has been honored for his deep human rights work as the recipient of the Magnitsky Human Rights Award, the Sakharov Prize for Journalism as an Act of Conscience, and the Geneva Summit Courage Award. In 2018, Mr. Kara-Murza served as one of the IOP Pritzker Fellows. Please join me in welcoming Bill Browder and Vladimir Kara-Murza.
I think we're going to start off by me saying a few words, then Vladimir saying a few words, and then we'll have a conversation, and then we'll have a few words with you. Ellie left off one thing, that I'm a 1969 graduate of the lab school nursery school. I went all the way from the nursery school through the University of Chicago, and so I'm like deeply entrenched in this community, and I'm delighted to be back here among, it's like my homecoming. I thought what I would do for a few minutes, just to frame our discussion, is to tell you the Magnitsky Act story in brief, because it tells you everything, and it also brings Vladimir into the story, and it gives you, and then we can talk about how this all has led us to both becoming big enemies of Vladimir Putin. So I've got a strange reason for being interested in Russia, which was that my grandfather was the head of the American Communist Party between 1932 and 1945. And so when I was going through my teenage rebellion, I tried to figure out a way of rebelling from this family of communists. And the best way I could think of rebelling was to put on a suit and tie and become a capitalist. And so I became a capitalist. I ended up going to Stanford Business School, and I graduated business school in 1989, which was the year the Berlin Wall came down. And as I was trying to figure out what to do with my life, I thought, well, wouldn't it be poetically and elegant if my grandfather was the biggest communist in America and the Berlin Wall has just come down? I'm going to try to become the biggest capitalist in Eastern Europe. And so that's what I set out to do. And I achieved it to a certain extent. I first moved to London, and then I moved to Moscow, and I set up an investment fund called the Hermitage Fund, which became the largest investment fund in Russia with $4.5 billion under management. The problem was that in Russia, they kind of built the house without putting in the plumbing and electricity. And the plumbing and electricity was rule of law and property rights. And so I was investing in all these companies, where the people who were the majority shareholders of these companies would steal all the money from the companies. And so that didn't make them very good investments. And so I tried to figure out a way of stopping the stealing. And the normal tools that you would use in a situation in a civilized country, like going to the police or going to government regulators, didn't work in Russia because the police and the government regulators were all on the payroll. And so I figured out the only way I could really stop this nastiness from happening was to research how these oligarchs and corrupt bureaucrats did the stealing, and then share that research with the international media. And so I developed this practice of doing naming and shaming campaigns against crooked Russian oligarchs. And for a while, this whole thing worked, and it worked for a very strange reason, because when Putin first came into power, he was fighting with the same guys I was fighting with. The oligarchs were stealing power from him at the same time as they were stealing money from me. And so for the first few years I was doing this, even though I've never met Vladimir Putin, he was a strong ally in my fight against the oligarchs. Every time I would put some scandal into the public domain, he would come in like a ton of bricks and do something using whatever power he had in the presidency to stop these bad things from happening. And for a brief period of time, I was supportive of Vladimir Putin because I thought that he was doing this to make Russia a better place. Turns out that he was only doing this because he didn't like the oligarchs. And I learned this firsthand because he ended up arresting the richest oligarch in Russia, a man named Mikhail Khodorkovsky. He put him on trial, and he allowed the television cameras to film the richest man in Russia sitting in a cage on trial. And if you were the 17th richest guy in Russia and you saw that happening, a guy far smarter, richer, and more powerful than you, your only reaction was you didn't want that to happen to you. And so the other oligarchs went to Putin and said, what do we have to do to make sure this doesn't happen to us? And he said 50%. And at that point, Vladimir Putin became the richest man in the world. And at that point, I was no longer fighting with his enemies. I was fighting with people who were representing his 50% economic interest. They couldn't tolerate me carrying on doing that. And in 2005, I was expelled from the country and declared a threat to national security. In 2007, My Moscow offices were raided by the police. They seized all of our documents, and they used those documents to perpetrate a very complex fraud where they didn't steal my money, but they ended up stealing $230 million of taxes that I paid to the Russian government from the Russian government. And I hired a young lawyer named Sergei Magnitsky to investigate this fraud. He was the one who figured out all the details. He was the one who testified against the officials involved. And in retaliation for his testimony, he was arrested on the 24th of November, 2008. He was put in pretrial detention. He was then tortured to get him to withdraw his testimony. They put him in cells with 14 inmates and 8 beds and left lights on 24 hours a day for sleep deprivation, post-sleep deprivation. They put him in cells with no heat and no window panes in December in Moscow, so he nearly froze to death. They put him in cells with no toilet, just a hole in the floor where the sewage would bubble up. And the purpose of this was to get him to withdraw his testimony, and they wanted to get him to sign a false confession to say that he stole the $230 million, and he did so on my instruction. Sergei refused. For him, his integrity was more important than anything, and they just kept on ratcheting up the pressure. He ended up getting very sick. He ended up losing 40 pounds, developing pancreatitis and gallstones, and the authorities ended up refusing him all medical treatment for his ailment. And on the night of November 16, 2009, Sergei Magnitsky went into critical condition. And on that night, instead of putting him in the hospital, they put him in an isolation cell. They chained him to a bed, and 8 riot guards with rubber batons beat him to death. He was 37 years old. And I got the news the next morning, and it was the most heartbreaking, life-changing news I could have ever gotten. And I made a vow on that day that I was going to put aside all of my other activities and go after the people who killed him and make sure they face justice. And for 10 years, that's what I've been doing. And originally, we tried to get justice inside of Russia, but that didn't work. The Putin regime circled the wagons. Vladimir Putin personally got involved in exonerating the people who played a role in Sergei's murder and in covering up anyone's liability. And so I said, if I can't get justice inside of Russia, I need to get justice outside of Russia. And that's when I came up with this idea of the Magnitsky Act. They killed Sergei Magnitsky for money, for $230 million. And they don't keep that money in Russia. They keep that money in the West, where it's safe. And these people, they buy houses in the south of France. They buy houses in London and Aspen and South Beach and New York. They send their kids to boarding school in Switzerland and the UK. They send their girlfriends on shopping trips to Milan and their wives to doctors on Harley Street in London. And I came up with this idea that we may not be able to prosecute them for torture or murder in America, but we can certainly stop them from traveling to the West, and we can freeze their assets. And I took this idea to 2 senators, Senator Benjamin Cardin, a Democrat from Maryland, and Senator John McCain, a Republican from Arizona. And they came up with this idea of doing legislation. And they called it the Magnitsky Act after Sergei Magnitsky. And there's a lot of things that people disagree on in Washington, but the one thing they seem to be able to agree on is that Russian torturers and murderers shouldn't come to America. And when I went for a vote in November of 2012, it passed 92-4 in the Senate. It passed 89% of the House of Representatives, and it became a federal law on December 14th, 2012. After the United States, we, actually before that, after the law was passed, Putin went crazy. He banned the adoption of Russian orphans by American families. He made it his single largest foreign policy priority to repeal the Magnitsky Act. He sent his own emissary, a Russian lawyer named Natalia Veselnitskaya, to Trump Tower on June 9th, 2016, to meet with Donald Trump Jr., Paul Manafort, and Jared Kushner to try to get the Magnitsky Act repealed. I'm pleased to say it hasn't been repealed. Nothing near that has happened. In fact, the Magnitsky Act has been broadened in 2016. These same senators proposed the Global Magnitsky Act to sanction not just Russian human rights abusers, but human rights abusers from every country around the world. It passed in December of 2016. On the same day as the Global Magnitsky Act passed, the Estonian parliament voted unanimously for an Estonian Magnitsky Act. Following that, the Canadian Parliament in October of 2017 unanimously passed a Canadian Magnitsky Act. Following that, in November of 2017, the Lithuanian Parliament passed the Lithuanian Magnitsky Act unanimously. The Latvian Parliament passed the Latvian Magnitsky Act. The next summer, the British Parliament passed a British Magnitsky Act, and we're now working on the European Union. I've been traveling around the world. All these countries that I've mentioned to you, Vladimir has been the Russian voice I've told the Magnitsky story about why it's necessary, and one of the most important things is to have somebody who speaks for the Russian people, not the Russian crooks, but the Russian people, to explain what Russians think about the Magnitsky Act. And Vladimir has traveled all over the world with me at great personal peril. They tried to kill him twice for his work doing this, but he's thankfully survived and still with us here, and I'm delighted that he's joining us to share his perspective on this story.
Well, thank you so much, Bill. It's great to be in your alma mater, and I want to thank the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago for hosting our meeting tonight, and it's wonderful to be back. I've had the privilege early last year of being the IOP Pritzker Spring Fellow in 2018, and it's certainly great to be back after 18 months absence, and I hope this is not the last time. And thank you to everybody for coming, and we had first snow in Moscow last week, but it wasn't as cold as it is here tonight, so I feel right at home in one sense, but very chilly on the other as well. Early last week, we had the annual commemoration ceremony in Moscow, known as the Return of the Names. This is when people come to the Lubyanka Square, the site of the Soviet KGB, where there's a memorial stone that was brought and installed there in the early 1990s from the Solovki concentration camp, the first concentration camp set up by the Bolsheviks in Soviet Russia after the revolution. And every year, people line up, thousands of people line up to read out the names of the victims of Stalin's Great Terror, 1936, 37, and 38. And the line takes hours. I came in the morning, took quite a few hours to get to the microphone. And they always give you a piece of paper with a random name from a list. And this ceremony has been going on for 13 years now, and we're still not through the list. And this is only Moscow, only one city, and only 3 years, 1936, 37, 38. It's just to give the context of the scale of communist terror that happened in our country in the 20th century. And so I was given a name. It was a tractor driver, 26 years old, arrested and shot in 1938. And then you have a chance to read the names of your own relatives who were killed in communist terror, and there's no family in Russia that has been spared this in one way or another. And so after reading the name I was given, I also read the names of my two great-grandfathers who were killed under Stalin, my grandfather who spent 2 years in the Gulag. And then I read out two names of much more recent victims of state-driven terror in Russia. And those were the names of Sergei Magnitsky and Boris Nemtsov, two very different people with very different lives, with very different areas of work, but who didn't know each other in life, but I think who share a very important trait that has been shared by many people throughout our history. And it's a phenomenon of Russian history that has been noted by many people, and that is that our country has had more than its fair share of tyranny and repression and dictatorship under different guises, Tsarist times, communist times, what we see now under Putin. But in every one of those eras, however strong the oppression, however difficult that task was, you would always find people in Russia who are prepared to stand up for truth and justice. And that was the case in the Russian Empire, that was the case in the Soviet Union. It is certainly the case in Russia under Putin today. The Putin regime is not a totalitarian state, not like North Korea. They do not demand full obedience and full loyalty. You can get on with your life as long as you don't challenge the fundamentals of the system. And both Boris Nemtsov and Sergei Magnitsky, in their different ways, challenged the fundamentals of the system. Boris Nemtsov, of course, was the most prominent, the most effective, the most powerful opposition leader in today's Russia, former deputy prime minister, somebody who was a brilliant communicator, who could find common language with different audiences, who could organize and lead thousands of people in opposition marches, who managed to win elections even in today's conditions when opposition is not supposed to win elections. Who was a very powerful and effective voice for the Russian democracy movement on the international level. And they couldn't scare him, they couldn't intimidate him, they couldn't drive him out of the country. And so on the night of the 27th of February 2015, he was gunned down by 5 bullets in the back on a bridge just across from the Kremlin. Sergei Magnitsky was somebody very different. He was a tax lawyer, he was not nationally known. But he, in his own place, in his own work, he couldn't stand by and watch the fraud that was being perpetrated on his own people. As Bill said, and it's important to emphasize this, that $230 million or 5.4 billion rubles was not stolen from Bill Browder, it wasn't stolen from Hermitage Capital Management, it was stolen from the taxpayers of Russia. And Sergei Magnitsky, as a Russian citizen, as a Russian patriot, just couldn't stand by and let it happen. And so he did what any law-abiding person would do, and that is to call the attention of the authorities. And you just heard from Bill what happened to him for that and the price he had to pay. Now, Boris Nemtsov and Sergei Magnitsky didn't know each other, as I mentioned, in life. But for me, there's a very important connection between them because I've had the honor and the privilege of working together with Boris Nemtsov for more than 15 years, from the late 1990s and until that wretched night on the bridge near the Kremlin in 2015. And it was Boris Nemtsov back in 2010 who got me involved in the Magnitsky Justice Campaign, an international campaign for the Magnitsky legislation. And it was back then in 2009, around the autumn of 2010, excuse me, a year after Sergei's death in a Moscow prison, that I heard about this idea of this draft law, this bill being put forward in the United States House and Senate, a bill that put forward a principle that sounds as obvious today as it sounded revolutionary back then, and that is a principle of personal individual accountability for corruption and human rights abuses. In the previous eras, international sanctions regimes would target entire countries for the actions of their rulers and the actions of their government. A good example of that is the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which the US Magnitsky law overturned and made null and void in 2012. And the Jackson-Vanik Amendment was put forward by the US Congress in 1974 in response to the restrictions on Jewish immigration from the Soviet Union. And the response was general trade sanctions against the whole of the country. And that was the way sanctions regimes used to operate. Somebody doesn't like what a government of the country is doing, they target the whole country. The brilliance and the absolute brilliance of the Magnitsky Act is that it targets the people who deserve it. Instead of targeting 140 million people who live in Russia for the actions of a small band of crooks and criminals around Vladimir Putin, it goes after them. And you just heard Bill describe the principle behind the Magnitsky Act, and that principle is that the people who are personally complicit, based of course on credible evidence, in corruption and gross human rights abuses would no longer be able to get visas, own assets, or use the financial and banking systems of the countries that pass this legislation. And above all, this law is very just because it targets the people who deserve it. But as importantly, it is also, in the case of the regime of Vladimir Putin, extremely effective. And the best way to judge this effectiveness, I think, is the hysterical, absolutely hysterical reaction that the Putin regime had and continues to have to this whole process, to this whole movement, to this whole international justice campaign. And the reason it is so effective and so powerful is this absolutely astonishing hypocrisy and double standard that we see built into the very heart of the Putin system of power. And that hypocrisy consists in the fact that the very same people, the senior officials and the oligarchs in and around the Kremlin, who abuse and attack and undermine and violate the most basic norms of democracy and the rule of law in our country, in Russia, very much like to enjoy the privileges and the benefits and the opportunities and the freedoms afforded by the very same principles of democracy and the rule of law in the West. Because it's in the West where they keep their money, buy their villas and their yachts, keep their wives and their mistresses and educate their children. And that's why there's nothing, literally nothing, that the Putin regime hates and fears more than this principle of individual accountability. It has been an honor for me to be a part of this campaign for nearly a decade now, for 9 years. As Bill mentioned, the Magnitsky Act is now law in 6 countries around the world. The United States was the first one. Since then, others have joined: Canada, the United Kingdom, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. We are certainly continuing this work in other countries. Just, a couple of weeks ago, we were together in Sweden and Stockholm at a joint Nordic-Scandinavian hearing on the Magnitsky Act at the Swedish Parliament. Before then, we had a hearing at the French National Assembly in Paris, had meetings at the German Bundestag. There are several other countries where similar initiatives are being put forward, and we're certainly going to continue working on this in the most effective way that we can. And Bill just mentioned the adoption of the Magnitsky Act in the US Congress, which came first in the House in November of 2012. And I'll never forget that day. It was November the 16th, 2012, the third anniversary of the killing of Sergei Magnitsky in a Moscow prison, when the House of Representatives passed it by nearly 90% of the vote. And that day, or that night, it was the evening, Boris Nemtsov and I were sitting in the visitors gallery in the US House of Representatives chamber in Washington, D.C., watching members take a vote on this. And when it became clear that the vote will pass, and of course, as you know well, they record the votes in real time, so as members come in and vote, you see the number reflected on the screen. The Russian Duma, for example, works in a different way. They vote first, and then you see the final results on the screen. Here you can sit and you can watch while the vote is being taken. You can see the exact moment when you have more than half the votes and when the law is being passed. And when that moment happened, when we saw that there were more than 50%, 218 votes in the House of Representatives, Boris Nemtsov turned to me and he said two things, which I'll never forget as long as I live. First, he said to me that the Magnitsky Act is the most pro-Russian law ever passed in any foreign country, because it targets those who abuse the rights of Russian citizens and who steal the money of Russian taxpayers. And the second thing he said to me that day was that when we have democracy and the rule of law in Russia again, he will be the first person to go back to Washington, back to the US Congress, to ask them to repeal that legislation, because we will no longer need it, because we will have our own law enforcement and justice system that will be able to take care of the crooks and the criminals and the abusers at home, where they should be taken care of under the law. Now, we know that he will not be going anywhere and advocating for anything, but I can tell you that I very much look forward to the day, if I'm still around then, when that happens, when we do have democracy and rule of law in our country. And I do want to go back to the US Congress and thank them for their support at a difficult and pivotal time, and to ask them to repeal that legislation, and to ask all other parliaments who pass that legislation, not the global ones, because that's now forever a universal instrument for targeting and bringing accountability for human rights abuses, but as far as it relates specifically to Russia. And I know that when that day comes, it'll be one of the happiest days of my life. But we're not there yet, unfortunately, and looking at the short term, I very much look forward to continuing to work together with you, Bill, to get that law passed in as many countries as we can, and we certainly have several lined up for the next few months and years. So a lot of work to do. I think we're going to the conversation mode now.
Yep.
And if I could usurp the microphone, since I already have it, and ask you the first question. One of the most revealing things for me during this almost decade-long work on the Magnitsky Act didn't concern, the Kremlin or the people in the Putin regime, because we knew what to expect from them anyway. It concerned the enablers in the West.
Yeah.
And I have to say that a lot of my friends and colleagues back in Russia, and I must confess, before all of this work, I had to an extent those rose-colored glasses too. A lot of people have this picture in absolute terms, in black and white terms, that you have the crooks and the criminals and the abusers, in authoritarian states, and then you have all those wonderful people in Western democracies who only think about human rights and the rule of law, and how, yeah, I hear the reaction. But living in an authoritarian state, a lot of people do have that notion. And then, when I began to work on the Magnitsky, in the Magnitsky campaign in 2010, I encountered the Western enablers. And it's been said that the biggest export from Vladimir Putin's regime to the West is corruption, and I certainly agree with that. But of course, that's a two-way street. And for somebody to be able to export corruption, someone else needs to be willing to import it. And as I discovered in these last 9 years, there's no shortage of people who are willing to export it, no shortage of enablers. And one thing I will never forget is a meeting, I had a working breakfast at the British ambassador's residence in Moscow in the spring of 2016, when there was a British parliamentary delegation visiting Russia, and I got a call from the ambassador asking if I would come in to give them a breakfast briefing, because they would meet people in the foreign ministry, in the Duma, and all these official places. And the ambassador, wanted them to hear the opposition viewpoint as well. So I said, of course, I'm happy to come in and talk to them. And so we had a breakfast, Chatham House rules, unfortunately, so I'm not at liberty to disclose the names. I hope I will be able to one day, but I'm not now. And it was a very polite as British usually do, a very polite conversation on this and that and the other, until the subject of the Magnitsky Law came up. And when I started talking about the importance of the Magnitsky Act in the United Kingdom, one of the British members of Parliament broke me off and began literally shouting across the table. His face went red. He became all agitated. And his point was basically, you know, how dare I talk about things like this? And why should they deprive the City of London of millions of pounds in profits over some human rights hearsay? That was the phrase he used. And I have to be honest with you, this was the spring of 2016, just over a year after Boris Nemtsov, the Russian opposition leader, was gunned down in the middle of Moscow. And the ambassador's residence is just across the Kremlin from the river, so it's literally a few hundred yards from the bridge and from the memorial where people still continue to bring the flowers and light candles in his memory. And this was very shortly after my first poisoning, when I was still recovering, after the coma and everything that went with it. I was still learning to walk again, using a cane. I was hardly sitting there. And to hear this member of the British Parliament talk about profits for the City of London, I have to be honest, I had nothing to say to him at that moment. I wanted to ask you, Bill, if you could, you write about some of these people in your brilliant book, Red Notice, but could you talk a little bit about the enablers,
yes,
and Western enablers you have encountered in your work over the last decade?
Yeah, I think that in a certain way, the Western enablers are worse than the Russian crooks. And I say this, and that may sound strange hearing it, but the bad guys who we're dealing with in the Putin regime, they've all come from a terrible environment where, from the moment they emerged into the world, it was just horribleness and treachery and hardship and just, straight from, nothing good has ever happened to them. And so to a certain extent, you can almost understand it's just a continuation of a really terrible situation. It doesn't excuse what they do, but it kind of explains what they do. But when you have somebody who went to the same school as you, who maybe worshipped in the same church or synagogue, and the person who came from a loving family, who consciously makes the choice to do this stuff, in a certain way, that's like worse in my mind. That's more treacherous than even these violent Russians who are doing this nasty stuff. And I've spent a lot of my time, and Vladimir has too, dealing with these Western enablers. And there's sort of two types of enablers. There are the bureaucratic enablers that we encounter in different governments, and then there's the really proactive enablers that we encounter outside the governments. And I want to talk about both very briefly. I was in Washington about 3 weeks ago, and I was invited in. I should say, normally in the past, I haven't been very welcome in the halls of government. Government officials have generally viewed me as just like a no upside type of person. If they end up meeting with me, I'll force them to do something they don't want to do. But recently in the U.S. government, I've been welcome, and I was particularly welcome in the Treasury Department. The woman in charge of the sanctions program in the Treasury Department, the woman who was, her name, I think she's just recently resigned. Her name is Sergei Magnitsky, but she's been the person who's been implementing the Global Magnitsky Act and the Magnitsky Act and doing it very aggressively. And she invited me there because she had read my book, and I was interested in meeting her because I watched all these people, including a lot of people we wanted to get sanctioned. And we were both there sort of in awe of this new tool and happy. I was happy that she was like so aggressively using it, and she was happy that I created, and it was all one big, very positive meeting. And I said, it's really nice that I'm here, and it's so nice that I'm feeling all this, that you're doing stuff and it's so positive. I said, but it wasn't always like this in the U.S. government. It's been quite different. And she said, that doesn't make any sense. That's like, how could that be? I mean, this is such a valuable tool. It's so incredibly tough on the bad guys. And I told her the story, which I'll tell you, is that when we tried to get the Magnitsky Act passed, the Obama administration had come up with a policy called the reset policy with Russia. And however much you might like President Obama, he decided that the best way of dealing with Russia was basically to forgive whatever sins and just reset relations. And so everybody was instructed to like not do anything that would upset Vladimir Putin or Russia. And all of a sudden I came up with this policy which was going to upset Vladimir Putin and Russia, which was to hold people responsible for crimes in the Putin regime. And there was just absolute sort of across the board passive aggression by all government officials to try to do everything possible to stop the Magnitsky Act. And they really did a lot of stuff to try to stop the Magnitsky Act. And the only reason that we were able to make it succeed was that because the US Constitution, the legislative branch is a co-equal branch of government to the executive branch, and nobody in Congress was going to lose a single vote by banning Russian torturers and murderers from coming to America. But if it hadn't been for that, we wouldn't have had a Magnitsky Act, because it didn't matter how powerful how terrifying these stories were about what was going on in Russia. There were all these institutional enablers that were ready to just go with the program, which was to reset relations with Russia. And the moment you step outside of the government, you have people, and this is where it really gets ugly, you have people lawyers, public relations executives, investigators, former intelligence officials, who are all actually on the Russian payroll, doing things to try to help Vladimir Putin. And I encountered this in full Technicolor in 2016, where they went on a massive multi-million-dollar campaign, the Russians, hiring a bunch of Western lawyers, PR people, et cetera, to try to change the Magnitsky story, to claim that Sergei Magnitsky wasn't murdered, he died of natural causes, that he wasn't a whistleblower, that he was a criminal, and that the entire Magnitsky Act was based on a fraud. And they went around, they made a movie about it, they got, they found even one member of Congress who was a Republican from Orange County named Dana Rohrabacher, who was going to try to get this thing screened in Congress. They had this whole program going, and these were people in Washington that went to the same parties and the same schools and had kids in the same programs and stuff as maybe as you even, and that they could do this with a straight face, and they could do this with without any shame, and there's a lot of these people around, and we're not just seeing it with Russia. We've just seen it with this whole NBA story with China. And in a certain way, that's the worst thing ever. Is that we all think of ourselves as sort of good. We're all good people. We live in Western society. It's all fine, but there's a lot of people in our world that don't share these values, and they're ready to sacrifice what matters and what's important for money. I'm writing my second book, and that's a big part of my second book, is to talk about the Western enablers, and I'm not going to be shy about naming names.
The best way I've heard this described was in a book written 40 years ago by Vladimir Bukovsky, the great Soviet dissident who passed away last week, who wrote, this was shortly after he was expelled forcibly from Soviet prison to Switzerland in 1976, and after he spent a couple of years living in the West. He was writing about much of the same stuff that I just referred to, talking about my friends and colleagues, that a lot of us living in authoritarian societies have these rose-colored glasses about the West, and then suddenly those glasses were gone, and he saw everything that was actually happening. And he wrote, this is his book called Letters of a Russian Traveler, published in 1980, so almost 40 years ago. And he has a phrase in that book that for so many Westerners, for so many Western Europeans and Americans, the ability to fry their morning bacon on Soviet gas trumps any kind of human rights concerns. And 40 years have passed and nothing has changed in this regard. And I think both you and I have witnessed this very vividly working on the Magnitsky law in the last 9 years. But I also want to say that all of this resistance crumbles when these arguments go out in the public, because there's no, as you said, there's no public argument in support of allowing torturers, murderers, and crooks into your countries. And so all of these people, all the Obama administration officials, and I can certainly vouch for that, I've seen so much resistance from them as well, and so did Boris Nemtsov, who tried to prevent this law from taking place. All of this was done, in the corridors, in the offices, behind the scenes. Nobody would come out in public and say, no, we want to defend the rights of the murderers and crooks to come in here. And as soon as it came out in the public, they lost, and we won.
Yeah, that was the naming, the naming and shaming, putting it out into the open, and it's very interesting in terms of how we actually advocate for this whole thing. Because sometimes the best thing is to have people who oppose it. It's sometimes better to have a fight about something than just to have something that's pure and good and wonderful. Because pure and good and wonderful doesn't get anyone's attention. But the moment you get somebody evil who's on the other side of it, then it starts getting interesting. And we're now in Europe trying to get the EU to do a Magnitsky Act. And Vladimir and I have been to a number of different national parliaments. We've been to Brussels. Actually, the European story is quite extraordinary, actually. We in 2014, the European Parliament unanimously passed a resolution calling for the EU to do a Magnitsky Act. And however, the Parliament doesn't have the same power as the Congress here does. So Congress here, if they do something unanimously, it becomes a law. And the European Parliament doesn't have that power to dictate European policy. And so it goes to somebody who's in this job called head of the External Action Service. That probably doesn't mean much to most people here. The External Action Service is the State Department of the European Union. And the person who is in charge of this External Action Service is determined through a closed-door backroom negotiation behind where nobody knows. There's no transparent process to how this person gets chosen. It's like some weird European politics. And so the person who was chosen was an Italian woman named Federica Mogherini. And Federica Mogherini comes into this role. She sees this request on her desk. And she's not been elected to anything by anybody. And she writes a letter back to the European Parliament, which is the representation of all the people in Europe, unanimously calling on this thing, saying, I don't think it's a good idea. Sorry, we're not going to do it. And so people in the Parliament were quite offended by this, and so they wrote back to her and said, we think it's a good idea, you should do it. She ignored that. Several more resolutions, more votes calling for this. Kept on getting ignored, same response. They had like a template, which they just sent out to respond each time. And then finally somebody pulled me aside and said, Bill, someone from the External Action Service, Bill, this is not going to happen at the EU level. If you want to make this happen, you're going to have to go to individual EU member states. So I start going to EU member states. And I go, one of the member states I go to is the Netherlands. And I thought that would be a really prime member state because they had just had MH17, the plane that got shot down, the Malaysian, and of the 300 people on board, 200 of them were Dutch. It's like their September 11th. And so I went to Holland and I asked, and we started campaigning for it in the Netherlands. And the government, who desperately didn't want to do this, even though they had like lost 200 people through a Russian missile, they couldn't say openly, as you know, they didn't want to do it. They wanted nothing to do with it, but they couldn't say openly they didn't. And so they had to say, we think it's a really excellent idea, but it should be done at an EU level. But here's what so I had friends in Parliament, and they took advantage of this insincerity, and they put together a resolution calling on the government to then saying, okay, we're formally instructing you to go to the EU and formally introduce this at an EU level, and if it doesn't succeed in 6 months, then you have to do it at a Dutch level. And the government said, well, we didn't quite mean it that way, and so on and so forth. But the Dutch politics, they have what they call a minority government, which means that it's a coalition of a lot of different parties. The main government party, along with the far right and the far left, voted against it, but all the other parties voted for it, and we got a majority. And it forced the Magnitsky Act into play. And so they had to go, and they did, and they proposed it. And so now we've discovered that Hungary, which is headed by Putin's friend Viktor Orban, doesn't want the and it requires unanimity in the European Union to have this happen, and so they can sit behind closed doors and stop it from happening, and that's where we stand today, and that's our next big challenge.
We'll get it done, just like in all these other places. Now we go to the questions from the audience part, and the way colleagues from the IOP are indicating. There's a microphone you'll see here in the center. And just please approach the mic and please ask a question. The system used to function in the Congress of People's Deputies of the USSR back in the day. You used to have mics in the corridors. And so we're not going to call on anybody, just ask a question in turn. Please. Good to see you again.
You too. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Katrina, a Russian East European Studies major, fourth year. So, Litvinenko killed by radiation poisoning, Nemtsov shot very close to the Kremlin. I've even heard this argument made about the interference in the US elections that Russia isn't particularly trying to cover anything up or be secretive about it. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the balance that they strike between trying to cover up their crimes and using them to make a statement and very clearly link the crime to themselves.
Well, I think you've kind of defined the approach. So Vladimir Putin doesn't want to have any legal responsibility for any of these crimes, but he absolutely wants these crimes to be known to the people he's sending a message to. So when they're killing Litvinenko or they're trying to kill Sergei Skripal or other types of people, they're not doing it because Sergei Skripal is an incredibly important spy or Litvinenko is an incredibly important traitor. The point is that there's like 20,000 other guys who are just like Sergei Skripal currently sitting in Russia that could betray Putin, and so he's a guy who likes to govern by symbolism, and that's why they killed Boris Nemtsov. It's not that they needed to kill Boris Nemtsov to send a message to every opposition politician that you no longer risk jail, you risk death. Well, so what the message to these other guys, to the people in Russia, the secret service, secret police people, is it doesn't matter if you betray us, it doesn't matter when you betray us, doesn't matter where you betray us, doesn't matter how you betray us. We're going to track you down everywhere in the world, and we're going to poison you in the most terrible way, and you're going to die, and your family members are going to die. That's the message that has to be sent. But then they can also say, oh, and by the way, we have nothing to do with it when it comes to any legal responsibility, and that's how they like to operate. And the West, up until now, has more or less gone along with that and not created any consequences. And I think Britain is a dangerous place to live because the Litvinenko killers, nothing particularly happened to them, and other than a few diplomats being killed, being kicked out, there's no consequence to the Skripal poisoning.
I think that's, in a nutshell, the situation. And, Russia is a country of symbols, as you know, and to assassinate the main leader of the opposition steps away from the Kremlin, and then to continuously show on state television his body lying on that bridge. This is supposed to send a message to the whole country: don't, sit in your homes and don't do anything, don't meddle. It's important also to say that message hasn't worked, because we see more and more people, especially young people in Russia, as we saw just this past summer with the mass protests over the local elections in Moscow that nobody even frankly cared about before. But the regime was so brazen and so blatant in banning every single opposition candidate from that election that, well, people took it as an insult, as a personal offense. And we saw the biggest wave of opposition protests this past summer in Moscow that we've seen in years. And so the message hasn't worked, but yes, I completely agree that it's intended that way. With Litvinenko too, there are many ways to get rid of an opponent, even for a brutal authoritarian regime. They did this in a way, the most horrible, the most painful, the most visible way for the whole world to see. And then, of course, they come in and say, we're nothing to do with this. But also, at the same time, the person who's been officially indicted in Britain for this murder suddenly becomes a member of the Russian parliament. And that's a message as well, that, we cover up for our own. And yes, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. We may have had something to do with this. But also, just going a step back, I want to say, because you asked that in the question, then you corrected yourself, and Gretchen also corrected herself in the introduction. I always plead with Western audiences to be very careful about the language. Please don't say Russia when you mean Putin and the Putin regime. That's what they want you to do. Vyacheslav Volodin, who's the current Speaker of the Russian Duma, said publicly on the record 5 years ago, and I quote, "There's no Russia without Putin," end of quote. I've never heard anything as insulting about my country as this phrase. They want, everybody to think that they are Russia. And Russia is so much more diverse, so much bigger, so much better than that small band of crooks and criminals sitting in the Kremlin. So let's not play into their hands and equate the two things. They're completely different.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Yang, fourth year in sociology. So a common criticism to involve human rights in many Western countries is that it might be a cover for real politics. And I want to know what specific aspect of Magnitsky Act would be in a better position to win more trust, not only in Western democratic country, but also people from authoritarian regime.
Well, it sounds the main way in which the Magnitsky Act works is, I mean, there's so many hundreds of thousands of terrible human rights abuses that it would never be possible to sanction all the people that are doing these terrible things, and so the U.S. government and the Canadian government and hopefully soon the British government pick sort of emblematic cases. And so, for example, the case of Jamal Khashoggi as a good example outside of Russia of someone being sanctioned, where you just can't invite journalists to your embassy who are critical and then chop them into little pieces. And then they picked, and it's interesting because it's not just. I mean, so here you have a situation where Saudi Arabia is a friendly ally of the United States, and the U.S. Sanctioned 17 Saudis. They didn't sanction Mohammed bin Salman, but they sanctioned 17 other Saudis. And so far, they've picked cases that are what I call extreme, well-known, and emblematic cases. And I don't think there's anybody in the West that views any of these cases as being sort of realpolitik. I mean, if they sanctioned some Saudis, they also sanctioned an Israeli billionaire. The United States sanctioned an Israeli billionaire. And so the great thing about Magnitsky is that it doesn't matter what the relationships are between the countries. Israel's a great ally of the United States. But this Israeli billionaire, his name is Dan Gertler, is alleged to have been involved in some of the most horrific kleptocracy in Africa, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And there's perfectly good relations between the United States and Israel, but this guy, there's no, he's now, there was no way to get him other than through the sanctions, and that's how they ended up getting him. And so I don't think it's so far been politicized, and I don't think anyone's really critical of the Magnitsky law for that purpose so far.
I would add that if there is a problem with the Magnitsky Act implementation, it's actually the opposite. It's that the legal standard built into the law is so frustratingly high that it takes so much time and so much effort to sanction the people who very obviously belong there. I'll give you just one example. There is a person in Vladimir Putin's government called General Alexander Bastrykin. He chairs the investigative committee of the Russian Federation, which is the equivalent of your FBI, so the top law enforcement official in the current Russian government. This guy, not only has he been involved in all the political persecutions of the last several years, the Yukos case, the Bolotny case, the Magnitsky case itself, many, many others. Not only has he blocked and sabotaged the investigation into the murder of Boris Nemtsov, not only has he been involved in all the cases of political prisoners, but he also, a few years ago, personally, talking about the top law enforcement official in the Russian government, personally took an independent journalist, deputy editor-in-chief of Novaya Gazeta, Sergei Sokolov, to a forest near Moscow, drove him into the forest, took him out of the car, walked him in, and said to him, if your newspaper continues to publish what you're publishing, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to bury you right here in this forest, and guess who's going to be in charge of the investigation? Because I'm the head of the investigative committee. And that's not in dispute. He admitted this. He also said sorry afterwards, but I don't think that cuts it as a level of responsibility if a top government official threatens to kill a journalist. And it took the United States government 4 years to sanction this guy under the Magnitsky Act. They finally did in 2017, but it took more than 4 years to do so. And so if there is a problem with implementing the Magnitsky Act, it's the opposite from what you're asking. It's the fact that it's so frustratingly difficult to get people who should be there on the list. But thankfully, slowly, much slower than we would like, much more difficult than we would like, but this process is going ahead. And now in 2019, there are several high-ranking human rights abusers, not only from Putin's regime, but also from the Saudis and Venezuelans, Iranians, other authoritarian regimes around the world, who are on that list, and we're hoping that this process will continue.
Thank you.
Thanks very much to both of you for speaking with us today. Both of you were talking about how the Magnitsky Act is really like a pro-Russia act because it's very precise in who it goes after, and it targets basically like the crooks. But like given this, I was wondering what your thoughts are on like the more broad sanctions that the EU and the US imposed on Russia following Russia's annexation of Crimea that basically contributed to like the collapse of the Russian ruble and kind of like ended up affecting the broader Russian population.
Well, first of all, a lot of the Crimea sanctions have followed exactly the model of the Magnitsky Act, and they have been targeted. So the people who were personally responsible for the war in eastern Ukraine, for the annexation of Crimea, for everything else, MH17, same thing. A lot of these sanctions have been targeted. So when this concept was introduced in the Magnitsky bill, and almost a decade ago, it's now a concept that's widely accepted in the international sanctions regime. The targeted nature of this is being used not only over human rights abuses, but over wars and annexations and all the other violations of international law. The biggest economic sanctions imposed, the biggest general economic sanctions imposed on Russia after the annexation of Crimea were imposed by Vladimir Putin, not by the EU. When in the summer of 2014, he imposed a blanket ban, or his government imposed a blanket ban on the imports of a lot of food products and other produce from Western countries into the Russian Federation. It wasn't done by the West, it was done by Putin. So that's the biggest general sanction imposed on Russia. There has been some wider general sectoral sanctions imposed by the EU. I must say, as I alluded earlier in explaining why I'm involved and continue to be involved in this international campaign for the Magnitsky legislation, I'm in support of personal targeted sanctions, not general sanctions. It's not, why should the whole country suffer because of the actions of a few criminals in the Kremlin? And when Boris Nemtsov got me involved in the work on this, in this Magnitsky justice campaign, the principle that he would always voice in explaining his position on sanctions was, and that's a phrase he often used himself, don't touch the country, punish the scoundrels. And that's exactly what the Magnitsky Act and wider the targeted sanctions over other abuses like Crimea and others do. Don't punish the country, punish the scoundrels. And that's the principle I subscribe to. I don't think general sanctions work. A, I don't think they're just. B, I don't think they're effective. And C, in fact, I think they're very useful for Putin's propaganda purposes because they make it very easy for the Putin regime to try to explain away the economic problems, the very real economic problems that are mostly caused not by any sanctions, they're mostly caused by their corruption, their mismanagement, their policies, meaning the people in the Kremlin. And they just explain it away, oh, it's all Obama's fault. And so I'm not in support of general economic sanctions against my country. The Magnitsky Act, again, the brilliance of it is that it introduces a principle of personal accountability. The people who are held responsible are the people who deserve to be held responsible, and that's the way it should be done, in my view.
You're saying that nobody in Congress would support crooks and murderers, but now we have the spectacle of almost every Republican in Congress supporting the biggest enabler of a kind of gangster system that is very much associated with Putinism. So my question is, how would you frame, supposing an article of impeachment relating to Ukraine gets into the Senate, how would you frame this as having a connection with setting up or enabling a gangster system in Ukraine that spills over borders and even seeks to establish a personal loyalty system in the United States under the guise of the unitary executive? How would you frame that as an argument that 20 Republicans would believe, so we get back to the idea that nobody in Congress supports crooks and murderers?
As a former American, Bill, I think
Well, I tell you something which is interesting. I don't know how I'd frame it, but I've been living in the UK for the last 30 years, and there's sort of a similar there was a similar sort of run on the system by the current government. They tried to, I mean, with different tools and different issues, but they tried to suspend Parliament so they could jam through Brexit at the very last second, and something really interesting happened in the UK, which is that 21 members of the Conservative Party said the country is more important than party, and they voted against the idea of basically suspending Parliament so you couldn't discuss Brexit, and that led to the whole series of events. And one can only hope that when push comes to shove around here, that there are people who think that country is more important than party. And I have no idea when this thing finally comes to a head, what the description of the alleged crime will be, and whether that's enough to make that happen. But I mean, when you think about it, I mean, it's quite remarkable that this country has literally millions of people that are ready to go die for the country in the military. But there are people working in Congress that are not even ready to lose their job for their country.
I'll just say, in answer to your question, it's probably not my place as a Russian to comment on your U.S. domestic politics. There seem to be enough Russians trying to meddle here in the last few years. I don't want to be one more. What I would say is, just listening to your question, listening to Bill's answer, I'm just full of envy of the fact that you're talking about parliaments, votes, members of parliament. Well, we haven't had a parliament for 2 decades almost. Our parliament is not a place for discussion, as its own speaker once said publicly, and it's going to be one of the phrases that defines the Putin regime in future history books. And so I'm just envious of a system where you can freely go and criticize your government, your head of state, including from the highest legislative body of the land. And all I can say is that, you know, my colleagues and I are doing our best to work towards a day when something like that is possible in Russia as well.
Thank you so much. And you spoke of Western enablers of oppressive regimes, and you also spoke of, because of the lack of legal infrastructure and political situations in Russia, that right now you're focusing your energy on having foreign governments pass the Magnitsky Act as a smart and effective measure. And I was wondering whether or not you are concerned about, when you're dealing with Western politicians, that your issue, which you care so deeply about, is being appropriated by these politicians for their own political agendas. And if I may illustrate it with a context that I'm familiar with, for example, there is a small but very vocal group of US politicians who may use the human rights situation in China, or even like the situation in Hong Kong, as their own political theater to burnish their image as a human rights defender while they keep pushing racist and other types of oppressive and discriminatory policies in the US.
Well, I think everybody has their own agendas, and everybody has their own issues, and everyone uses and has reasons to do things. But I think that everybody who I've dealt with in Congress, I was at the session before here, I was at the business school, the Stigler Center, and Professor Luigi Zingales said, how is it that you've been able to, why are you so effective that you were able to get a law passed in the United States? And I said, I don't think it has to do with me. I think it has to do with the story, that anybody who hears the Magnitsky story wants to do something about it. I mean, you can't hear that story about a young, idealistic patriot who witnessed a crime in his country and exposed it, thinking he was helping his country, and then having him be killed and having having the murder be covered up. I don't think any reasonable person would not be moved by that. And sure, there's a lot of cynical people doing a lot of cynical stuff, but I think that the reason why the Magnitsky Act passed 92-4 was because why would you not want to pass the Magnitsky Act? I mean, it just doesn't. And to get a law passed in the United States, it's like the probability is like smaller than winning the lottery. I mean, it's just infinitesimal. And the fact that it passed, says that sometimes people who go to, I mean, I believe personally that maybe a lot of these politicians have dishonest views in a lot of other areas, but they didn't start that way. I think they all started that way with some idealism, and we actually presented them with something they could do something good about, and that's where we ended up with the Magnitsky Act.
I'll just say that there are many things that politicians can do to advance their own political interests, to use for their own gain. If they want to advance their political interest by passing human rights accountability legislation, then God help them. We need more politicians like that. And colleagues from the Institute of Politics saying that we have time for 3 more questions, and I see 3 more questions here, so that's perfect. So we'll take all the questions, and then that will complete our session tonight.
You had mentioned a multiplicative number of times the fact that not every citizen in Russia is one of the corrupt politicians attacking and targeting a number of different people. What do you believe America already is or could do further to be able to apply aid for individuals of whom are victims and citizens of Russia who are not harming other individuals?
Thank you for the question. Well, the most practical, the most effective thing is for more Western democracies to pass this legislation for individual accountability for human rights abuses and to send a clear, very clear message that the crooks and abusers will no longer be able to use their territories, use their financial systems, use their banking systems. Other ways that could be very powerful and could be helpful. Last week, we marked Political Prisoner Day in Russia, October 30th. Traditionally, since Soviet times, it's been marked as a Political Prisoner Day, a day to remember all of those who are serving time in prisons and camps and detention colonies, having committed no crime, just past unwritten political lines drawn by the regime. And unfortunately, that's another bad Soviet tradition making a comeback. We have, according to latest figures, we have more than 300 political prisoners in Russia today, and that's a conservative estimate. And so we held a big international conference in Moscow last week at the Sakharov Museum to mark Political Prisoner Day. We had representatives from major human rights groups, both Russian and international. We had diplomats from many embassies. We had, most importantly, human rights activists, civil society activists, journalists from Russia attending that event. And we had the lawyers and the families of political prisoners, because that's very important to show that these are just not abstract numbers or statistics. These are real people with real lives who are being wrecked, by this authoritarian, kleptocratic regime that's in power in our country. We've had the daughter of Anastasia Shevchenko, who's under house arrest in Rostov-on-Don, a single mother and opposition activist who was the first target of the new law against so-called undesirable organizations. Now, Putin's Justice Ministry now has power to declare any NGO undesirable, and its leaders and members can be liable for up to 6 years in prison. She's one of them. We had the mother of Alexei Pichugin, who's the longest-serving political prisoner in Russia. He's been in prison for more than 16 years because he's a hostage in the Yukos affair. Bill referred to Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who spent more than 10 years in prison himself. Well, this guy, one of his former employees, is now in prison for more than 16 years. And there are many, many others. And it's important, to answer your question about the international role, it's important to raise those cases and to talk about those issues. And, there was a time, I'm a historian by education, and there was a time in the 60s and 70s and 80s when American presidents of both parties would start the high-level summits with Kremlin leaders by placing lists of political prisoners on the tables and advocating for their release. Even Richard Nixon did that, not somebody who's generally associated, with standing up for human rights, but he did, and he managed to get out some prisoners of conscience out of Soviet prison. Of course, Jimmy Carter did that. Of course, Ronald Reagan did that. We see nothing like this now, not just in this country, but in other countries, with some exceptions. Angela Merkel, the current Chancellor of Germany, played a significant role in helping to get Mikhail Khodorkovsky out of prison. And the most recently released, the most prominent prisoner of conscience of those recently freed, Oleg Sentsov, a Crimean film director, was released in large part thanks to the advocacy by Emmanuel Macron, the current president of France. But those are unfortunately exceptions. So I think more should be done on that level as well to advocate for political prisoners in Russia. And the other thing I would say is international accountability for those crimes and those abuses. One of the things we have been really grateful to the US Congress for in more recent months, so since they've passed the Global Magnitsky Act, they have really taken the lead on a bipartisan basis. Again, something that doesn't happen too often these days. But there were 2 resolutions passed in the House and Senate this year, basically launching an international oversight process in the case of the assassination of Russian opposition leader Boris Nemtsov. And since those resolutions, the OSCE has taken up the case and is currently in the process of producing a special report. And that's a poor substitute for national justice, which should be the priority, and one day it will be possible, but until it is, we need international oversight. And we're so deeply grateful, in this case, to answer your questions, to the US Congress for leading on this, and it passed the Senate unanimously, and it passed the House by 416 to 1. Yeah, there are not many measures that pass with such large majorities nowadays.
Who's the one?
Everybody asks this. Let me remember his name. Thomas Massey. He's a Republican from Kentucky. He's Rand Paul's friend.
Okay.
So he's one of those isolationist types.
Thank you.
Just wanted to say I read your book, Burn Notice, and watched your documentary, and I really like what you've done and continue to do on this issue. But that being said, I was wondering if you could sort of fill us in on sort of the financial impact of the Magnitsky Act, sort of what it did, to whom, did it trap money, if so, how much, and how have people started to work around it? I work kind of in that nexus where we watch a lot of these transactions every day, OFAC transactions, and we monitor a lot of people on this list, and I'm always curious about, how are people getting around this, because I'm sure they're trying. And then kind of a question for you, Vladimir, how has the Magnitsky Act been sort of viewed by the average Russian person, and how has that evolved as time has gone on?
Mm-hmm. So I would argue that the most dramatic effect of the Magnitsky Act is not on the people who are sanctioned, but on the people who are not yet sanctioned. So the Magnitsky Act, what it does is it puts somebody on the OFAC sanctions list, the U.S. OFAC sanctions list, which is the Office of Finance and Asset Control of the U.S. Treasury. The sanctions list is a list that consists of terrorists, drug criminals, and human rights abusers. And they're all put on the same sanctions list, and it has the same impact, which is that when you're on that sanctions list, every bank in the world subscribes to a service that gives them that sanctions list. And every bank in the world cross-references all of their clients with that sanctions list. And the moment that a person gets put on that sanctions list, their immediately accounts are closed and they're fired from the bank. Because it doesn't matter whether it's a US bank or a Chilean bank or a Dubai bank or a South Korean bank, no bank wants to be in violation of US Treasury sanctions. Because if you're in violation of US Treasury sanctions, you have to pay the US government in fines 3 times the amount of money that you've transacted for a sanctioned individual. So let's say there was a situation where a Russian oligarch had $1 billion of money in Credit Suisse, and he got added not to the Magnitsky list, but to one of the other sanctions lists. And all of a sudden, Credit Suisse froze his money. Why did they freeze his money? Because they said to themselves, okay, if he gives us instructions to send his money to Gazprom Bank, $1 billion, we're going to have to pay possibly $3 billion of fines to the US Treasury. The upside to that transaction is they get a $150 transaction fee for wiring the money. Hahowever, this is where the story gets really interesting and answers your question. The other side is that the guy whose money is frozen at the bank, it's his money. The Swiss haven't made any sanctions law. This was, the Credit Suisse is doing it because of a US sanctions law. And so he can go and sue Credit Suisse saying, I was going to invest that $1 billion in like the newest tech startup that was going to go up 100 times, and so you're going to owe me $100 billion. And so what does the CEO of Credit Suisse do at the end of, look, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't? He gathers up all of his account officers and says, I want you, preemptively, I want you to fire every dodgy character that we have in this bank, Russia and everywhere, because I don't want to ever have this problem again. And so Russian oligarchs and bad people from all over the world are getting fired from these banks and can't transact because nobody wants to end up in this kind of horrible situation. And so it's just, dictators will always have an immense amount of power, but we've changed the balance of power slightly, so all of a sudden they're living in fear of what could happen if they get added to the sanctions list, and that's really not a pleasant place to be. And from our standpoint, and all victims from all over the world, there's now some recourse. We can do something about it, and more than anything, it gives everybody a little bit of hope that the world is not such an unfair and horrible place.
Thanks for the question. It's a fundamental one, and as we were talking earlier about the difference between kind of the general sanctions and the individual ones, it's easy for an authoritarian regime to kind of rally the people around the flag, as it were, against the general sanctions, and to present, in this case, the West as being against the whole of Russia, against all the people of Russia. It is really difficult for them, for the Kremlin propaganda, even with all its highly developed propaganda machinery, to try to present a case where a crook oligarch is not allowed to go to vacation in Miami as anti-Russian. Everybody's going to love the fact that this crook is not being allowed to go on vacation in Miami. And in fact, when the Magnitsky Act was passed, in December of 2012, the Levada Center, which is the last more or less reliable independent polling agency in Russia, conducted a poll of attitudes among Russian citizens to this law. And it found a strong plurality, 44% of Russian citizens, in support of this legislation, which is astonishing given all the propaganda that was directed against it. To answer your question, it's a very popular concept that at least there is some small shadow of accountability for the people who have continued to steal money in Russia and then go and spend it in the West. Given the system, given the regime we have today, there's little we can do at home to stop them for now from stealing in Russia. But what the Magnitsky law does is stops them from being able to spend that stolen money in the West. And so it's a very popular concept. As I said, it's a very pro-Russian concept. But it's important to emphasize also that everything that we've talked about over this past hour and a half, the Magnitsky sanctions, are a pale shadow of real accountability that these people should face. If you kill someone, if you torture someone, if you steal billions of dollars, your punishment shouldn't be a cancelled visa or a frozen bank account. It should be something much, much more serious. And one day, I have no doubt, this real accountability will come in our own country, as it should under the law. But until that day, we have to use those international mechanisms, and this is the best one available, to keep these people accountable, at least to this small measure that we can do it today.
Well, thank you both. I think you're doing God's work, so thanks.
Thanks for your question. And a final question of the evening.
The last question. Hi, my name is Leonid. I'm class of '83 and a beneficiary of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, so don't knock it. I came here in '79 as a refugee. This is the last question. I'll make it one for Bill and one for Vladimir. First of all, thank you for the discussion and your work. So a question for Bill. One of the senators who voted against Magnitsky Act, one of the four, is Bernie Sanders. So I want to know what the story there is, since this is, Institute of Politics. And an easy question for Vladimir is this. So I want to talk about Russians, not the Russian government. What is it that makes Russians so different from Ukrainians? I mean, in 28 years, Ukrainians had 2 revolutions, threw away their dictatorial government, and are moving toward Europe and democracy, even though they're kind of at war. And the Russians, despite being very close, and they haven't done that. So you talk about that there's a difference between government and population, but the population cannot be completely absolved. I mean, somehow in these 28 years in 2 very similar countries, we have 2 different outcomes. Thank you.
I don't know why Bernie Sanders. I think Rand Paul was one of the other ones who voted against it. Or no?
Carl Levin was definitely one. He's no longer in the Senate.
White House. I don't know. It's a very good question why Bernie voted against it. One of the other people who voted against the Magnitsky Act, the Global Magnitsky Act, was Tulsi Gabbard. Yeah. For what it's worth, the people who were running the anti-Magnitsky campaign in Washington in 2016, one of the professional enablers in Washington who was working for the Russians against me and trying to smear me and changing the name, trying to change the narrative of the Magnitsky story, has become Tulsi Gabbard's attack dog against any of her enemies in Hawaii and in her presidential thing. And so everybody was all sort of shocked by Hillary Clinton's statement, but based on my experience with just these two facts, it gives me more reason to believe that either she's a witting or unwitting asset for the Russians. But I don't know much about Bernie Sanders. It seems to be there seems to be sort of a popularity on the far left for Putin. We have the same thing with Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, and I don't quite understand how that could be. But these are not communists. There's no klepto-fascism is not the same thing as left-wing leftist policies.
I'll just add, if I may, very quickly on what Bill was just saying. In my years of working with Western politicians on these human rights issues, I found both in the U.S. and in Western Europe that it's never about a party. You have, if you talk about the U.S., in both main parties, you have people who are strong on the rule of law and human rights and who are strongly standing up for those principles, and you have enablers. It's never a Republican-Democrat issue. And if you're talking about Western Europe, it's the old horseshoe theory. The biggest supporters of Putin are either hard left or hard right, and we hear from them every time we go to a parliamentary hearing. We can trust, those two fringes to come out and basically give out Putin's propaganda points. But on your question to me, the reason I'm in all of this work that I've been doing, I get asked sometimes, why do I do all of this? And I think a big explanation for that is that for me, for my generation, I'm 38 years old, and for my generation, the earliest and most important and most influential formative experience was what happened in our country in August of 1991, and I'm old enough to remember that. Unfortunately, I always, this is something I'm always upset about, that I wasn't old enough to participate. But I'm certainly old enough to remember how, in the early morning of the 19th of August, 1991, the top leadership of the KGB and the Soviet Communist Party decided that enough was enough. Forget about these experiments with glasnost and perestroika. Let's go back to how things used to be before. And those people had everything at their disposal. They had the whole propaganda machinery. They had the Communist Party. They had the government apparatus. And of course, they had the army, the police, the overwhelming machine of repression that was the Soviet KGB. And they had the tanks, which we saw on the streets of our city. I'm a Muscovite. We woke up and we saw tanks going on the streets where usually only buses and cars went. And so those people had everything on their side, apparently. And Russians, Muscovites, people who refused to accept that turn to the back, were not armed with anything except their own dignity and their determination not to let this happen. And my father was one of those people. And they went into the streets, in the hundreds of thousands on the streets of Moscow, and stood in front of the tanks. And the tanks stopped and turned away. That is my first major memory of my life, and I saw this with my own eyes. So there's nothing wrong with the Russian people. I completely reject this, cultural determinism that, these Russians are just not ready. They're not. No, this is complete baloney. If you look at the history of Russia, you'll find that every time the Russian people actually had a choice between dictatorship and democracy, they always chose democracy. 1906, the first elections to the Duma, when the supporters of Tsarist autocracy won 0 seats, and the election was won by the Cadets, the leading liberal party at the time, the Constitutional Democrats. 1917, when the election to the Constituent Assembly was held after the Bolsheviks seized power by force, and they lost it to a party that advocated for a democratic parliamentary republic. And of course, 1991, not just the coup that I mentioned, but also the presidential election of that same summer, when Boris Yeltsin, who was the candidate of the Democratic opposition, defeated the Communist Party candidate by 57% to 17. And that is a choice of the Russian people. And so I agree with you to the extent that you cannot completely absolve the people from what's happening in the country. And I think if you look back at what's been happening over the last decade, you saw the protest on Bolotnaya, you had the youth-led protest called by Navalny in 2017, 2018, when all across the country people came out to protest against this regime of kleptocracy and nepotism and corruption and everything else that it represents. And of course, we've just seen what happened this past summer, these past few months in Moscow, where you had tens of thousands of people going to the streets, despite the horrendous police brutality, where policemen would, punch women in the stomach with police batons and give people 4-year prison sentences for just standing on the streets. After that, you still have thousands and tens of thousands of people going to the streets to protest against this regime. So, if anything, these are not very hopeful times in Russia politically, as I don't need to tell you, but if there's anything that does give us hope for the future of our country is looking at those young people. And when I mean young, I mean really young. When I go around the country and meet these activists, I feel like an old man, because they're 18, 19, and they're high school students and university students, and they're the future, and they're increasingly fed up with this regime. And so when I look at them, I'm filled with the hope for the future of our country, and I know that everything we're doing is not in vain. And the IOP colleagues are telling us that we're done talking for tonight, and I just want to thank the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago, Gretchen Sims, the director, and everybody who made this evening possible. And it's wonderful to be back here, and Bill, to your alma mater, and I hope we're going to do this again sometime very, very soon. And thank you to everyone for coming and for the very informative and interesting questions tonight.